I was asked essentially to give a training on the European online public space, and there's a slight problem with that, in that I'm one of the very few people you'll ever meet who actually refers to it in those terms. It's been called the Euro blogosphere, it's been called the Euro geekosphere, I'm not making this up, Web 2 EU and various other monikers, and basically I guess you may have come across this before, you definitely will in the future. Whenever you see that happening, whenever you see something being called about 15 different things, it means there's no consensus as to what it actually is. So difficult to give you a training in something that nobody can agree on, what it actually is. All I can really give you is my personal perspective on it. And I'm going to be coming back to the importance of personal perspective, wrong laptop, throughout this presentation, which I hope to get done within the hour that we have so that we can ask some questions. So when I say I'm going to tell you what it is and why it matters, I'm telling you what I think it is and why I think it matters, and what some of the problems I think it faces and what some of the opportunities are as well. Because if you ask 15 different people, you get 15 different answers, and there are not 16 people to ask anyway. If I'm going to give you my perspective, I better introduce myself, but that's already been done very quickly. So I've been doing online communications for the EU since '95. Before that, I was a science writer. That was what was between studying theoretical physics and ending up in Brussels. And in fact, I ended up writing about the EU's research programs here in Brussels when I first arrived as an unemployed backpacking Australian. And the thing is, writing about science and writing about the EU are very, very similar things. In fact, the EU and science are both very important. They're both full of jargon. They're both closed sort of societies, require a lot of study, and the skills sort of transfer. And then, I got into online comms. Anyway, you can find out more about me if you check out my blog. Many of you have, and I do thank all of those who submitted questions to the blog. I hope I helped answer them, and I hope I'll cover the questions in this presentation. But we can come back to them at the end as well, because each of you asked something different. I can't go into all of them in depth, because that would take a day, not an hour. Sorry. One thing I'd like to really stress, I'm not a social media expert. I think I pointed that out in my post, which I published beforehand. Social media is, for me, just one tool in the toolbox of communications. That toolbox includes non-online as well as online. Social media is not even the latest tool in the box. I do online comms for the EU institutions, and social media has to be integrated into that, otherwise it won't be as effective as it could be. So, in order to answer this question, what is this European online public space, I'm going to show you a picture. Can anybody tell me what that is? Football pitch? Do you think you could probably play hockey on it if you really wanted to? Hockey is a good game too. It's like football but for people with brains. You could probably play rugby in it, although after Sunday I don't think anybody should play rugby ever again. You could probably have a political rally in it. You could probably have a rock concert in it. In other words, it's a multifunctional space, and very similar in fact to the EU online public space. It's not one thing. It depends on what your perspective is, and once again I'm going to give you my perspective. I define it very simply. I define the European online public space as simply the place where people have conversations about the EU, policies and activities, using social media. Because if you don't use social media, then you're basically in a cafe down the road at Place Luxembourg. And those conversations can be, come to bury it or reform it or destroy it. It doesn't really matter what those conversations are about, just discussions about the EU. So I really stick with a very simple definition. Now, what you want to talk about depends on who you are, your perspective again. My clients are EU staff. And whilst some people in the EU want to talk about Europe as a general whole, Europe is really cool, great, young people should love Europe. Most people in the EU have got their feet more firmly on the ground. They've got a policy or a program that they need to promote to a specific audience. Now, I mentioned earlier when I first got here, I was doing a lot of writing work for the research programs. So a lot of my thinking starts from that place. And, they've got research programs, they've got money, but they need project proposals. And a lot of the time they want more SMEs in their project proposals. And they also want SMEs to take the results of the research projects which they fund and actually use them to improve their competitiveness and create jobs and drive us all towards the glorious Europe 2020. So they've got that sort of aim. Other parts of the EC will be talking about training opportunities for young people, like Erasmus and things like that, or training opportunities for unemployed people, or underskilled people, or agricultural policy. In other words, almost everybody in the EU institutions who want to talk about the EU have got a very specific area in mind, rather than Europe as a whole. Now, lobbyists, I don't spend any time with lobbyists. I assume that they spend their time talking inwards towards the EU institutions. I really haven't got much to say about them. Then you've got your EU and social media geeks. I guess you could call me one of those, and I know quite a few. These are people who are both geekily into the EU and they like social media, so it's a pretty small subsection of society, and they'll have a completely different perspective on this. I guess I'm here and I blog. I don't blog for my work. My work doesn't give a damn about what I say in my blog. I blog, I guess, because I'm also in this group, and what I really want is the European online public space to help improve European democracy. And I think a lot of the people who would classify themselves in that area would probably have the same goal. Then you'll have MEPs. They'll have another different perspective. They'll want to get re-elected, and they'll want to push their party's political agenda, and so on and so forth. So, is that the European online public space? Well, no, I'm only really talking about the small part that I inhabit. So if we just go back out, if you remember, I was in the intersection of those three circles. Remember my little picture of my blog there? That's the intersection of three spaces within this circle here. One is Blog Active, which is where I put my blog. I don't know, who here knows Blog Active? Okay, a few. It's a blogging platform. If you want to start up a blog and you're focusing on the EU, you might want to start it up there as opposed to, say, WordPress.com, where it also takes about 3 minutes to set up a blog. It's just a place to host a blog. It's actually gotten pretty good. I launched it almost exactly 4 years ago when I was working at Euractiv. I was only there for 6 months. And at the time, we would just take anyone. There was nobody blogging about the EU apart from the geeks I mentioned earlier. I was checking out the homepage recently, and as a matter of fact, there are quite a lot of very good blogs there now. The advantage of setting up a blog on Blog Active, quite simply, is that it brings you traffic from Euractiv, which owns it. So, see, it's very easy to set up a blog. It takes a few minutes to set up a blog. What's really hard is building up an audience and getting noticed, and this gives you a little kickstart, you see. But the thing I regret about Blog Active is that there's no real sense of community. It's just a collection of blogs, a collection of posts, which is a shame, but hopefully it will develop further. Now, the geeks I was talking about, the circle of geeks I hang out with are the editors of Blogging Portal. Who here knows Blogging Portal? Absolutely no one. Well, you might want to check it out. It is not a blogging platform of any type. It's a place which aggregates blogs. I'll just reinforce that point. There we are. See, it's a blog aggregator. What it does is this. It's a site which sucks in, at the moment, 856 different blogs which talk about the EU. And there's 25 or 30 of us editors who, in theory at least, on a daily basis, check out the new posts from those bloggers and maybe categorize them by a particular theme or category, maybe promote some to the home page. There's a newsletter, daily, weekly newsletter. There's a weekly weekend blogging portal which looks at the highlights. And basically, this is absolutely essential to the development of the online public space, because if you want to do anything in that space, if you want to engage with anyone, you want to have a conversation about anything, you need to know who's having the conversation, where and when. And this is the tool that gives that to you. But it's completely volunteer effort. Absolutely no funding, absolutely no leader. It's a completely leaderless sort of hippie thing. The most interesting conversations I have about the European online public space are actually with the fellow editors by email. We don't even publish them most of the time. So it's done. It's something that you should know about. It's part of the universe I hang out with. A third part of my personal European online public space is this site, the IABC. That stands for the International Association of Business Communicators. This is something which is a Ning space. Anybody know Ning? It's very easy to set up a social network on Ning. And a friend of mine set this up. I helped him set it up. As a matter of fact, it was my idea to make it public, mine and one other guy's. we launched an event, and it's grown really, really well, and there's now lots of people who are members of this community, and it's a community of people who are focused on the EU and who want to learn about social media, so it's a learning community. It's a bit lightweight. You don't find a lot of really in-depth conversation, but there's lots of events, there's lots of cocktail parties and all that sort of thing, so I don't hang out there very much. A lot of professional networkers in this space, a lot of consultants, a lot of EU staff and lobbyists. Why the EU staff hang out with the lobbyists, you'll have to ask them. But it's another place where you can go and find out about the EU and social media. And these are the main places that I hang out with, in my space. But there's many others. I mentioned Cafe Babel over there, and there's many other people who are part of this zone. So is that it? Is that the European online public space? Thankfully, no. What I've been describing is the Brussels bubble, which is a term I came up with a while ago, and it seems to have gathered some legs. This is, of course, people like you, young, international, bright young things, who are having lunch on Place Luxembourg around the corner here in the summer sunshine, which happens once every few years here in Brussels. And really, the Brussels bubble it's not really a geographic space, but most of the people in the Brussels bubbles are here in Brussels. Some of them aren't, though. If we go back to Blogging Portal, one of the editors, a guy from called Martin, he's in Germany. Another one is Michael from France, and there's Macarena in Spain, there's Ralph in Finland. So some of the Blogging Portal people are not in Brussels, but most people in the Brussels bubble are here in Brussels, and that's a real problem. Because there's this disconnect between Europe and the rest of Europe, if you like. Now, these aren't the only people who are thinking about Brussels. The reason why I call Ralph and Martin part of the Brussels bubble, even though they're not in Brussels, is because they are looking at Brussels. For me, the litmus test is this: do they understand the difference between the Commission and the Council and the Parliament? Can they find their way through Europa? Can they handle Eurolex, the legislative database? And most of the people in the Brussels bubble are very much at home. They live, breathe, and urinate Brussels, even if they're not here. But there's another bunch of people, the Eurosceptics. I don't put them in the Brussels bubble, although they are also focusing on Brussels. They're looking at Brussels from wherever they may be. And look, I always mention these because they're so much fun. This is a great example of groupthink. I'm not talking about people who want less Europe, okay? That for me is a reform of Europe. Less Europe is just a reforming Europe. These people want to annihilate and destroy Europe. And when I launched Blog Active, I got called a Hitler apologist by these people. And there's a blog post about that, if you feel like looking at that. What's missing from this picture is intelligent skepticism, which I really regret. The Brussels bubble is just generally pretty pro-EU. There's one or two people who are sort of lightly skeptical. The guy who launched IABC's site, I think, is lightly skeptical. Sort of the idea that Europe is a good idea, but maybe there's too much of it in some areas and not enough of it in another. And then, of course, the Eurosceptic space are just anti-everything, but there's not a lot of intelligent skepticism, which is a shame. So, as you can see, there's a nice barbed wire fence between the two spaces. So is that it? Is that the European online public space? And the answer, of course, is no, because I've only been speaking for 15, 20 minutes, and it would be a short speech if that was it. My point is that most discussions about policy in Europe happen, of course, in national conversations. So, France, they're having a national conversation. The socialists just had a conversation that finished yesterday. They decided who's going to lead them into the next election. But there's an ongoing conversation about business policy, social policy, youth policy, the environment, that goes on at the national level. And of course, there are 27 of these national conversations. And they are separated from each other by barriers of language, culture, context and background. By context and background, I mean that even if I did speak German, which I don't, if I was to launch myself into an ongoing conversation in Austria, for example, about wind energy, don't know whether it exists, but anyway, if I was to, I wouldn't understand anything because I don't know the Austrian ministries, I don't know the Austrian minister, I don't know anything about the context of the background. And we all know that. We all realise that it's going to be very hard to understand the context of a country that we're not from even if we do understand the language, and so most of us don't bother. And after all, there are 27 countries. So this has been nicknamed by some people the Euro-Splinternet. 28 conversations. And this is a bit of a problem, because those national conversations going on will be influenced by stuff coming from Brussels, but they don't know about it. And the conversations going on in Brussels are influenced and should be influenced by the conversations going on at the national level. But there's not a lot of connection between the two. And that's a basic dysfunctionment. That's a dysfonctionnement, as we say in Belgium. We're quite expert at that here. And so it's a bit of an issue that you have all these 27 national conversations going on in social media in different ways in different countries, but there's no real connection with EU social media because the EU bubble is turned inwards. They're all looking at each other. It's very much a mutual admiration society where everybody says, you're doing great, but we don't listen to what's going on anywhere else. So we have a slight problem with Europe. At the national level, the national media support and, if you like, host the conversation about national policy. Does anybody here think that national media and national politicians explain the EU very well? Hands up who thinks they do a good job in their country. Probably not many. Certainly not in my country, which is Australia, but also Britain. So, of course, pigs will fly before the national media will do a good job of explaining what's coming from Brussels or how the national conversation should interface with the EU conversation. It's just not going to happen. It hasn't happened for 50 years. Why should it start now? And that's, of course, where social media comes in. Because social media allows the EU conversation to sidestep completely the national elite, the national political class, the national media, and talk directly to people where they are talking about a national policy in the same subject. Now, if that didn't make any sense, I'll repeat it. What I'm basically talking about is the first opportunity is outreach. Now, this is seen very much from my perspective. Remember, one of my major perspectives is on behalf of EU staff who want to reach people at the national level who are interested in a particular topic. Now, outreach, does anybody know what I mean by outreach straight away, off the bat? Yeah, reaching out, right? Not hard. It's basically, it's all really a question of going where the audience is. If you know that there's a bunch of people discussing environmental policy on an online community, or there's a hashtag on Twitter, or whatever, go there and talk about what the EU does. Because this is full of people who are interested non-specialists. When I say non-specialists, I mean they're not specialised in Europe. They're not EU geeks, okay? They are interested in butterflies, to use a metaphor from one of my posts. I like the butterfly lover metaphor. I'll come back to him in a minute. But somebody who cares about butterflies might care about pesticides, might care about herbicides, might care about organic farming, set aside, and all these big bundle of subjects because they love butterflies when they were kids. And if you have a community of these people, well, then you can go out there and say, well, as a matter of fact, we're working on reforming the common agricultural policy. And there's a way there that farmers can set aside land or farm organically, blah, blah, blah. And you can just reach out to those people and explain what the EU is doing in the field that they care about and why. Because I'm very keen on explaining this. I'm very keen on explaining the subsidiarity question. Why is the EU doing something in this area? Why not do it at the national or the regional level? There's usually a reason. Usually the EU can add value in some way. But that message never gets passed, and it's a real problem. Because if you sit people down, this has been done, there's a study in Sweden. You can sit a Eurosceptic down and say, okay, what is it you care about? And they might say jobs or environment or whatever. And then you can sit down and you can explain the logic of EU action in that field. And this has been done as a scientific study, and it showed that people left that conversation less Eurosceptic, because they actually understood the logic of EU action. Because that discussion only ever happens in Brussels. It happens at the Commission, at the Parliament, the Council. No one else is invited to that conversation. And that's a shame. So outreach, however, is not broadcasting. It's a conversation out there. Okay? If you want to outreach and go into a conversation, just think about Imagine that you weren't sitting down at a desk when I walked in, you were all having a cocktail party, you were all standing up in clusters, glasses of red and white wine, chatting about whatever it is you wanted to chat about, butterflies perhaps. And I came in and I wanted to reach out to you about, I don't know, common agricultural policy, organic farming at the EU level or whatever. Do you think I should walk in, open the doors wide and say, I'm here, I'm the European Commission, and I'm going to tell you all about what we're doing? Well, that's a terrible way of introducing yourself. You'd all turn your backs on me. Instead, I would look around the room and I would see clumps of people. And that actually mirrors what happens in online. This is just basic network theory, very quickly. You don't see 100 people, each of which knows 2 people. You get clumps of small clumps of people, each of whom knows each other really well, and then another clump over there of another group of people who know each other really well, and there's a couple of people who know each other across the room. That's how networks are organized, and this isn't just in online social media. This mathematical model has been known for decades. And so when you come into that cocktail party, you come into that conversation, you don't broadcast, you don't start talking at people as if they're journalists and you've got a press release, and you don't talk at them as if you are advertising something. Somebody once said that if you spoke to somebody face to face, the way that they are spoken to by advertisements, they'd punch you in the nose, and they would be right to, because, hey, would you like to buy my car? No, you're not interested. You're having a glass of wine with your friends. Piss off, not interesting. So you've got to have this sort of discussion, and you've got to engage with people as human beings, and that is what really sets social media apart from everything else. But if you look at this from the point of view of the European institutions, they're doing this in 27 countries, right? They're going to find the same sort of communities going underway in different countries, in different languages. What would happen if the European institutions, the programs, the policies, all these things, actually facilitated the conversation between those groups? That brings me to opportunity number 2, which is where things start getting interesting. Because I'm back to the Euro splinter net, and of course it's a nonsense to say that these are compartmentalized conversations, where there's no link between them. If you look closely, you'll find that there are plenty of people in one country carrying out conversations with people in other countries. There's one such conversation, and that is rather grandly called a transnational thematic online community of practice, or community of interest. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the difference between a community of practice or community of interest. Look it up. But basically, it's pretty straightforward. This is just a bunch of people who've gotten together to talk, to exchange ideas, to network, maybe discuss policies, or perhaps even get projects together to find jobs. Many people get involved in these conversations to raise their profile, to generate work, to improve their job hunting possibilities. Some even get laid, which is nice. This is basically what we call the long tail in action. I won't go into any detail about that. There's a post there. But the fact of the matter is that communities are no longer limited by geography. If you were a butterfly lover, like 1 in 10,000 people love butterflies, right? If you're in the Middle Ages, bad luck. You live in a village of 150 people. You're the only butterfly lover in the village. And, well, okay, you'll never meet another butterfly lover because, you can only travel 10 kilometers outside of your village in your entire life. Fast forward to the 21st century, your village has now got 2 billion people in it. 1 in 10,000? Well, do the maths. That's actually quite a lot of people. The long tail was developed as an idea for e-commerce to show that you could actually sell a lot of products to that 1 in 10,000th person. But it also works for communities. But there's always the issue of language. Now, hang on a sec. Where is Europe again? You see, every day for the last 50 years or so, the EU has been bringing together national policy experts to discuss policy, and ministers and all the rest. The EU has been bringing people together, but chosen people together to discuss common agricultural policies, fisheries policies, innovation policies, and to share experiences and ideas and discuss the policies and develop projects and network and get laid. The EU has in fact been creating communities of practice and communities of interest for decades, but you weren't invited. Because they've been doing it the old-fashioned way, conferences and workshops. And more recently, you can download the PDF of the final report from the conference 6 months after the event. So, opportunity 2 is about bringing a bit of Web 2 to this world. And I've done this 10 years ago. It works. It's about integrated European communities of practice. What does that mean? It's about building bridges between people in different countries, but who have a similar language. They will get together, they will talk, but they're going to be limited by language. But if there's a policy impetus, if there's a reason for it, you've got a better chance of getting their interest and networking them together. We're talking about bringing people together to discuss EU programs, exchange best practices at the national level. Here in Finland, we're very good at this, and people from Italy are very interested in that, and people from Spain have got an example of how this works, and just exchanging all these ideas and comparing results to discuss the interface between EU and national policy, and basically to learn from each other. And that, as I said, is what's been going on for a very long time. The difference here in the phrase integrated European communities of practice is that it's online as well as offline. It's not just an event which takes place here in Brussels and to which about 50 people are invited. Even if only 50 people are invited to Brussels to have the meeting, you can still open it up using online communications, and everybody can be invited. Now, there are some challenges to this to do with signal-to-noise ratios. The more people involved, the more chatter, and the lower the quality of the debate sometimes. But there's a general principle here. If you do that, if you say, hey, we're developing a new program at the European level, we want to improve organic farming or whatever, and you actually reach out to people at the national level who are interested in this topic and involve them in the discussion using Web 2 community approaches, you'll get better policy discussions, and you'll get better program implementation, you'll get better project proposals, and you'll get a better downstream adoption of the projects because more people will know about it. I can only skate over the very surface of this. There's some posts in my blog about it. But that's basically opportunity 2, and I'll come back to it a little bit later on. That's not all, though. If you put the two things together, you get something very interesting indeed. Take opportunity 3. Take somebody, a butterfly lover, in a country somewhere in Europe, cares about butterflies, cares about organic farming, cares about herbicides and pesticides. She's seeking information on this topic. Here she is. Maybe she's reached out to by an EU sort of initiative to reach out, a communications initiative. Or maybe she just tapped in some keywords into Google, and what she finds is this integrated European community of practice discussing organic farming and set-aside in the Common Agricultural Policy. So she finds an EC-sponsored online community where people across the EU are exchanging best practices about organic farming. And they're sharing ideas, they're networking together, they're discussing the relevant EU policies, which are under formation. They're even networking together to getting together projects for funding at national or European level. Basically, they're solving problems at the EU level. So what she's finding here is EU added value. The EU is the only organisation who can do that, who can build bridges across the different national spaces and bring people together to share ideas. So just by doing that, that is EU added value. But of course the results, the discussion, also demonstrate the added value of European activity in that particular field, in organic farming, because they're discussing how can we add value at the EU level. So she sees EU added value in action in an area she cares about. And that is opportunity 3, because that will both reach out to the non-specialist and explain EU added value to them, but also bring them in to a dedicated policy discussion that she might want to be involved in, and thereby improve that policy discussion, improve the implementation of that program. And that beats brochureware, that beats press releases designed to make everybody feel really European. It beats karaoke being held here in front of the European Parliament. That's wind. You need to demonstrate that Europe actually adds value. So do it, because it does. And social media is a great medium for this. Now, there's a lot of challenges that... So did you have a question? Sorry, you're just... There's a lot of challenges here. I'm not going to go through this in any detail because it would take too long. It's not easy to do what I'm saying. For a start, the online presence of Europa, of the European Union, the Europa website, needs to be improved to support these conversations. You can't have a good conversation unless there's a good background document to underpin it. And that is a real problem right now, because essentially Europa is still organised by institution, and your non-specialist doesn't care about the institution, certainly doesn't care about the DG. They just want to know what Europe is doing. So that's a real problem. The EU also has to invest in online community management, which is an emerging discipline. A lot of people react badly to the use of the word management. People don't like the idea that they're going to be managed. They're not being managed. The community is being managed. And that's just a question of stimulating the emergence of a community and make sure that it functions. It's the person who moderates comments, promotes comments, and is the interface between the community and the organisation. Rebutting Eurocrat would be a nice thing to do. And the last couple of points, the EU has started to make progress towards that in the last year or so, which is quite nice to see. One of the key challenges, however, is of trust. Anybody here a parent? I guess you're all too young. Oh, good on you. I've got 2 teenage kids, and I've had to explain to them quite recently that if they lose their trust in me, it's going to be very difficult for them to get it back. Because in order for me to trust them again, I'm going to have to trust them again so that they can prove they can be trusted. If you're an institution which is not trusted by an audience, why should they listen to you? They don't trust you, so they're not going to listen to you. They're certainly not going to give you the chance to prove that you can be trusted. So you're in a vicious cycle. When you lose people's trust, you're screwed, basically. Certainly, brochureware websites and press releases are not going to do it. What can do it is outreach, going out to them and explaining to them what you do and why, as long as, explaining your value, blah, blah, as long as you follow these particular traits. You've got to be completely honest and transparent. You've got to admit mistakes. You've got to treat people like adults. So that's the problem of trust. The other problem is of making a mess of it in social media. Who knows about the Nestle moment? That happened a few months ago. Basically, Greenpeace and a whole lot of other people hijacked the Nestle Facebook page, talking about palm oil and orangutans and things like that. Look it up, the Nestle moment. It's hilarious. And Nestle made a real mess of it, and it blew up in their faces. So this is also a problem that the EU institutions will have to face. But there's a bigger risk, and that's of not doing anything. Is this your profile where people spend their time online? You know that people are spending more time on Facebook than they are on just general websites, for example. Destination websites are becoming second-class citizens on the web. Is this what they see? This is where they spend their time. And you're not there. It's really not very impressive. Basically, what do you expect them to think if you're not there? Aren't you interested in what they have to say? What are you hiding? You're some sort of elite. It's not a very good impression. You really can't get your point across to people if you're not there with them. You can't expect them to come to you. They're too busy. So a very quick recap. Opportunity 1, that allows the EU to bypass national press, national political class discussions and actually reach people and discuss with them about what the EU is doing in areas that they care about. Web 2 techniques, online community techniques, will allow improvements to the way the EU implements its programs and develops its policies. And in the process will involve more people, which will both improve the actual implementation and also communicate better what the EU is doing. You put the two things together and you get an improvement in the current situation. Now, and there's a whole lot of challenges and risks, etc. So is that it? Well, it would be a start, and I was going to end there. Well, we'll just have a sip of water instead. I was going to end there, but then I received late last week an email that actually gave me the program. I actually got for the first time a reasonably good idea of who you were and what you were thinking of doing. And it revived an idea that I thought I would include in this presentation, because as I understand it, your policy researchers, young policy researchers, you've been doing some work in think tanks and stuff like that. And if I'm here, it's because you're sort of interested in what social media might be able to bring you. So here's an idea that came about with the Lisbon Treaty. Does anybody know what the yellow card procedure is? Okay, a couple of you. Basically, the yellow card procedure is one of those innovations from the Lisbon Treaty. Basically, whenever there's a proposal for EU regulation or any sort of legislative idea, Brussels sends the proposal to the national parliaments. Now, I'm very keen on this, and I was really surprised to find that nobody seemed to think it was important from a communications point of view. I'm also keen on it from a European democracy point of view because I think it's probably a good idea. A lot of, at least in Britain, a lot of parliamentarians feel that these deals are stitched up in Brussels, they have absolutely no oversight of them, and the whole European Parliament's just a joke, and these things get imposed on Britain, and Britain has absolutely no sovereignty. It's a bit of a misunderstanding, you could say. But the thing is that these conversations happen. Each national parliament has the same period of time to decide, is this proposal in line with subsidiarity? Does it make sense to do... Excuse me for 1 second. A little bit less noise, maybe. Okay. Does it make sense for Europe to do something in this particular field rather than leaving it to the national parliaments? And what's interesting is that this conversation happens all at the same time, 27 times. It gets sent to all national parliaments at the same time, and they've got the same period to have that conversation. So that means there are 27 national conversations about an EU proposal all happening at the same time. And there will be a conversation about it because the national political conversation, the national policy conversation, is not completely, but is largely driven by the parliamentary agenda. What are they talking about in Parliament will be one of the main factors around what they're talking about in the newspapers and what people are talking about in civil society. Not the only one, but it's important. So, sorry, before I go down there. So here, for example, you've got a few people who are following the national conversation, and in comes a proposal from Brussels. Is this meeting the yellow card, the subsidiarity criteria? It would be interesting if, of course, that conversation happens in the national language, and here's one of them. This is a national blogger, embedded in the national conversation, blogging in the national language, and interested in this particular topic, because this is a topic about, I don't know, common agricultural policy, organic farming, or whatever. But it would be very interesting if this person was to curate the national debate and to do this in a common language, a widely read language. Basically saying, in my country, they're saying this about this proposal. Now, that wouldn't be very interesting if this person was alone. But if there was a counterpart in every other country, this would form a language bridge. Here's another national blogger, but also curating what's going on in her country at the same time on this on this particular policy discussion. And what's interesting, of course, is that rather than just curating the national debate and publishing it, they're also listening to the other 26 national debates as curated by their counterparts, and then translating that back into the national language. So this person could, for example, say, look, a friend of mine in France tells me that in France they're saying this and this about this particular policy discussion, whereas another friend of mine in Spain is saying this and that. And this is one way of bridging the national debates, which are happening in different languages. Now, as I said, it's a bit far-fetched. It's just an idea. The big question is, of course, this. Why would anybody make the extra effort? Why would you do that? Why would you both be in the national conversation talking about, what concerns you at the national level, and also keeping an eye out for what's coming from Brussels, what they're discussing in Brussels, and then translating that for the other bloggers in your national blogosphere, and talking to other people like you in the other countries? Why would you do that? Well, you would be part of a cross-EU conversation about the policy. That's what you'd get, and that's what we need in the European online public space. We need a cross-EU conversation about these things. And from a personal level, you'd become the go-to blogger. Do you know what I mean by the go-to blogger? The person you go to when you want an answer. So you'd be a go-to blogger for two different groups of people. A fellow national blogger would look at you and say, that's the person I need to talk to find out what's coming from Brussels. Or what's going on in the other countries. So you become like the established authority in your field. You know what's coming from Brussels, and you know people who know what's going on in their national conversations. So you become an important node of a network. If you remember the clumps, the clumps, each national conversation is a clump. You become a node which is connected to the other clumps, which is a very interesting place to be. So from a national blogger's point of view, you're the go-to blogger for both what's coming from Brussels and what's going on in our field in other countries. And in addition, you are also the go-to blogger for the Brussels bubble. When somebody in the Brussels bubble wants to know, in this topic, in this country, who do I need to speak to? Well, I need to speak to that member of that network, because he or she is talking, already knows something about the EU, is already following me. Maybe has already commented on my blog, or maybe I've already commented on her blog, and he knows or she knows the people in their country and also their counterparts in other countries. So, although it's rather far-fetched, I was thinking about you when I was looking at this idea, which was for another Prezi, and thinking that it could be an interesting brand for you to pursue if you want to include blogging in your professional career, and you're here in Europe, so you're learning about Europe. It could be an interesting thing to do. Just a thought. Oh, lastly, I think somebody asked about the European Citizens Initiative. The same sort of network would also be a potential launch pad for getting a European Citizens Initiative off the ground. Although if you have a look at my blog about ECIs, you'll find that I share many people's opinion that the ECI is going to be sort of basically hijacked by the political parties and the lobbyists and the NGOs who already have the networks that are required. So not such a great thing. But we'll wait and see. Now, I'm coming close to the end. I'll just finish and then we can open up for questions. I'd like to conclude by saying this. The European Online Public Space will be what its participants want it to be. That's very important. It must be something which offers people something to contribute to it. They get something out of it. And it will be defined by the people who contribute something to it, essentially. It's got to be a commons, a successful commons, something which offers something to everybody. And it's got to be self-sustainable. It can't be owned or sponsored by one organization. It's got to be a common space. It's got to be self-sustainable. It must be independent. It can't be relying on an institutional funding program. It's got to be neutral. It's got to be like the air we breathe. It doesn't belong to anyone. Just at the end of last week, I got some questions emailed through to me, so I'll quickly cover them. There was a question, using a blog as a source of information. How do you know whether you should use a blog as a source of information? I sort of looked at that twice and thought, I guess I would answer that by asking, well, how do you judge whether anything is useful as a source of information? Do you think, for example, are you going to get a nice, impartial, analytical view of the European Union from England's Daily Mail newspaper? The answer is definitely not. Everybody knows that. They've got their reputation, they've got their position, and you know that you go there if you want all of your prejudices reinforced. Each blogger has their own reputation and has their own reputation for credibility, for honesty or transparency or the lack thereof. Basically, you look at a blog and you figure out who is this person and why are they blogging. You know, if they work for the European chemicals industry, then you're probably not going to get the same viewpoints that you're going to get from Greenpeace. The best bloggers operate a very transparent. They actually implement journalism better than journalists. They admit it when they're wrong for a start, and they show the limits of their expertise, and they state very clearly what their prejudices are, what their positions are, why they're blogging. Watch out for bloggers who don't tell you why they're blogging. There's something wrong with them. And what types of EU blogs? Well, I guess I just need to go back to here. You know, you've got your social media geeks and your EU staff and your networkers and your consultants and your lobbyists and the policy experts and all the rest. How does a blogger get its message across, and how does one get cited or noticed by bloggers? Those are two sides of the same question. The best way of being noticed by a blogger is to be a blogger. But you don't need to be a blogger to be noticed by a blogger, but it certainly helps if you engage on that blogger's blog and make useful, interesting comments. You just join their conversation. So come into that cocktail party, sidle up, listen to the conversation for a while. What are they talking about? And then add some comments. And if you're not blogging at this point, it means that all they'll know about you are your comments. They won't be able to follow the link back and check out your blog. So that'll be a bit of a lost opportunity. But you might not want to start a blog straight away. If you start commenting on blogs, you might find that that comment field is just not long enough. You can't really get all your ideas out. So what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to start up your own blog. So you might as well start it up first. That way when you start commenting on other people's blogs, they'll be able to come back and find yours. But that's a sort of personal choice. Basically, if you want to know how to blog, just go to Google, how to blog. You'll find thousands and thousands of resources about how to blog. Or find bloggers that you really like and find out why they blog. What are the motivations? My motivations are different from most people. It's not for me a business development tool. It takes a lot of my free time. It doesn't help my clients win work. It just helps me get my thoughts straight on a very complicated subject. That's really the only thing I get out of it, because you can really only get your thoughts straight when you write it down. And the nice thing about blogs is that you can take one idea and develop it, and then take another idea and develop it. And every now and then you can tie it all together. And along the way, people can give you ideas by commenting on your posts, and you can get ideas from other people from that conversation. So it's a more creative way of helping you get your thoughts into shape. That's why I blog. That's my personal reason. As for how to write a blog post, as I said, look, there's just so much online. You don't need my experience in that. Don't follow what I do. I do everything wrong. I blog very infrequently, and my posts are enormously long. But that's because I blog for my own amusement and to develop my own ideas. If you want to blog for other reasons, you should blog differently to me. But the most important thing I can really say is that if you are unsure about how to get started, then just get started. Just get started. It's really easy. It takes 3 minutes to set up a blog. Right. Let me just... I think I've finished.